Good evening, and I have a story for you tonight that you're just gonna be even bigger than any I've done so far. It's about Iran and how we got here. All the political backstabbing, the corruption, and the drama that got us to the February campaign with Israel and U.S. bombing Iran. The story starts about 100 years ago with a man named Reza Shah Pahlavi. He founded a dynasty in Iran in the mid-20s, and basically, just like anti-Turk in Turkey, sought to begin a process of modernizing Iran and making it a power. In the Iran and Germany had a strong relationship. During the beginning of the early days of World War II, Reza Shah Pahlavi quietly was being influenced by Germany, which at the time was under the Nazi regime. The British and Soviet governments felt that it was too close, so they intervened to remove the Nazi influence in Iran. And in the process, they got rid of the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty and put his son Muhammad Shah Pahlavi on the throne. That was the first turbulent part of Iran's political dynasty in the last 100 years. The U.S. started getting involved in this region in early 1946. Well, it's always been in the region, but where the first part of the U.S. involvement came in the immediate aftermath of World War II in 1946. The Soviet Union refused to leave the northern part in an area called Azerbaijan, which today has its own independent country, but also isn't part of Iran. This was one of the earliest crises for the United Nations. The U.S., Britain forced the Soviet Union to remove itself from this northern part of Iran, which they did. It was the first crisis. Then, in about 7 years later, this is another big earthquake in Iran's modern history. A man, Mossadegh, who was basically a reformer, which means he wanted to develop Iran into a modern economy, to have economic development for its people, and make it a modern state, free from foreign influence. But of course, Iran at this time has oil, and the big oil companies did not particularly when it dealt with oil contracts and who controls Iran's oil. Second, which of course led to the U.S., the United Kingdom, and certain other Western powers to remove Mossadegh in a coup in 1953, and this is where Iran's revolution began, was in August of 1953, called Operation Ajax. It was approved by the Eisenhower administration, and it restored Muhammad Shah Pahlavi, who in the beginning in the 50s and the early 60s sought to modernize Iran, develop its economy, and liberalize it socially, giving more women rights, getting away from the Shadar. But then another event happened in 1963. This is where the first name Ayatollah Khomeini first came. In 1963, Khomeini, who was opponent to many of the policies of the Shah and of course foreign influence in Iran, led a protest in 1963, and eventually the Shah had him deported out of Iran. Due to his protest over the Shah's program of reform in the 60s. And in the 1960s, several things happened. In 1967, the United Kingdom was having fiscal problems, so they decided to announce not only the devaluation of the pound, but they decided to move all military bases east of the Suez Canal out of that region, and that left, at the time in the late 60s, the United Kingdom had a big influence in the Persian Gulf. In fact, they had many bases there, and they would basically protected many of those emirates. And so this is where the United States entered the Gulf region, was really in the late 60s or early 70s with the Nixon administration. During this time, the United States, in the mid-Cold War period in the late 60s and early 70s, had basically a couple of guardians of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and Iran, which was to block Soviet satellite states in Iraq and Syria. And of course, this was a turbulent period in the Middle East, not just because of the Six-Day War, but there was a war in Yemen, nothing new there, and turmoil in Lebanon. But Iran was one of the United States' greatest allies. To this generation who grew up in the post-1980, it's hard to believe that Iran and the United States were that close, but we were that close, and we were providing on financial and military development in substantial amounts. In fact, Iran had one of the biggest bases in the Middle East for the United States. Two books I think you would find I have read about this. One called Kissinger, Nixon, and the Shah. And of course, the biggest one, the most influential one for me was, and it came out just the last 10 years, was The Oil Kings by Andrew Scott Cooper. This details exactly how the events that led to the 1979 revolution, why it happened. Many people now blame Jimmy Carter. He didn't help much because I don't think he knew much except for basic information on the Middle East. And he tried, but I don't think he had no background in the Middle East. Why he did not have a connection to that region. So his policies were mismatched or confused, and it led to a disaster which we're still facing today. So Carter didn't start the problem, but he worsened the problem. Where the bomb began came in May of 72. Nixon, on his visit to the Soviet Union in 72, according to the book, paid a call onto Shah Pahlavi in Tehran in 72. Because of the British withdrawal east of the Suez and the movement of the U.S. into the time, this is where the U.S. got tied in with Saudi Arabia and the petrodollar. And the U.S. basically signed a blank check with the exception of nuclear information. And I'll get into that in a little bit, but this is where the nuclear crisis began, was not in the last 10 years, but in the mid-70s. He gave him a black check because the Shah had money, and Nixon wanted money to, at the time the U.S. was in the financial problems because we had just devalued the dollar and the economy wasn't doing well, and he was trying to run for re-election in 72. So what better way but to use weapons to gain money, to sell it? It's a natural thing. That happened, and then beginning after 72, the arms deals between the U.S. and Iran took off. Now, the Shah got a lot of the modern U.S., even from according to the book, even before some of our military forces got some of the, at the time, the modern equipment. Now, where the nuclear issue came in this is where it gets more complicated. The Shah did want a nuclear weapon. Yes, he did want a nuclear weapon. And at the time, the United States did not, again, just like today, did not want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. We did allow them to have nuclear research. Yes, we did. But this was before 1980. So in the mid-70s, there was research technologies, but the Shah was unhappy, and after 1973, with the tripling of the oil prices, oil businesses just poured into Iran. Of course, when you get a lot of that, he had the money, and he was going to find a way to get a nuclear weapon as a means to make Iran. And there are interviews with the Shah on YouTube that shows exactly where he wanted to put Iran. He wanted to make Iran a first world power equivalent to the U.S. Yes, he wanted to make it equivalent to the United States and Soviet Union. In that way, to get rid of the foreign influence in Iran and basically go shoulder to shoulder with the United States. Of course, the U.S. wasn't going to have it, and this is where the problems began in the mid-70s. Nixon, the U.S. and Iran started struggling over oil prices. The Shah wouldn't budge on oil prices. In fact, wanted to continue pushing oil prices up. This was killing the American economy. Nixon and later Ford, according to the book, was really going to war with the Shah over the oil prices. The Shah wanted more oil higher oil prices because he was spending money on development and military weapons and was going to make it power. And this was not, and the U.S. wanted no oil prices, particularly after the Arab embargo. As I said, how can you get more exciting in the stories than oil prices, drama, and political intrigue? And Iran also, in the 70s, hosted a very important military bases that spied on the Soviet Union. So by the mid-70s, the Shah felt he was in command of. He was bigger than even the UK or the United States because he had no respect for Gerald Ford or even some of the British diplomats that they put over there. He felt he was bigger than either one of those. And at the time, who ran American foreign policy was Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger was trying to appease the Shah, and of course was saying one thing and telling Gerald Ford another thing. And they were trying to manage oil prices, and it was the problem. That's where the U.S. problems began. Then come 1976, there was a big conference in Doha about oil prices. Now this is where Saudi Arabia comes in. Saudi Arabia, the Shah agreed to a brief halt on oil prices to see if Gerald Ford would win the 76 election. Well, he lost to Jimmy Carter, barely. So the Shah was going to go back on a deal, and he was going to push for higher prices. In late 76, after the election, there was a meeting in Doha. Saudi Arabia opened the floodgates, which dropped the price of oil and hit Iran. This is really hard. All the spending that Iran was doing on development weapons came back to haunt Iran in the late 70s because of that event in the Doha meeting. And after that Doha meeting, the Shah really let Saudi Arabia have it. The news, according to the book, Andrew Scott Cooper's book, there was bitter attacks on Saudi Arabia, considering them traitors in the Islamic world. And I'm sure many other people in the Arab world felt Saudi Arabia was a traitor. This is why the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia was very important in the 70s. Then comes along, because of what happened in the economic calamity in Iran, 78, the terrorist activities in Iran increased. Economic collapse was becoming evident. And another mysterious thing, in 1974, the Shah found out he had cancer, which no one knew about. He had gone to Austria, one of the neutral, it was France, to a medical clinic in France, where they told him he had cancer. It was kept even from his wife, who had to go through other people to find out he had cancer, because they had to secretly bring doctors into the Nevaram Palace, which was the palace in Tehran. Well, he was fading in the late 70s. He wanted to live to see his son, who was still alive and living in the United States, become the Shah of Iran. But the events were moving speedily along, and finally weakened, and with the economy crashing and society going chaotic, he fell from power in January 79. They put an interim government but Khomeini was permitted back in, which brought the end to that Pahlavi dynasty completely. This is going to be the end of the part one of what I talk about, but if you can see what happened, Jimmy Carter, for all of his failings, wasn't where the problems really began. They began decades in the mid to the early 20th century. As I said, this story has a lot of power, drama, and political intrigue. The books are called Kissinger, Shah, and Nixon, and the Oil Kings. In my next segment, when I discuss on this part 2, we will go further after the Shah. But this is where the nuclear issue really took off. Thank you and have a good evening.